For decades, India has danced with the West to the tune of diplomacy, democracy, and development. The United States, ever the charismatic lead, held out its hand promising partnership, shared values, and mutual progress. The optics were glamorous high-level visits, defense deals, Silicon Valley love affairs, and photo ops at summits where everyone smiled like they'd solved poverty and climate change over canapes. But look a little deeper, beneath the press statements and diplomatic embraces, and what you see isn't a partnership, but a carefully managed performance. India was never invited to co-write the script. It was expected to play a supporting role in a story where the protagonist was always Western, always righteous, always in control. This partnership was never built on equality, it was built on utility. India, with its vast market, growing tech sector, and strategic geography, was a convenient chess piece, a counterbalance to China, a buyer of weapons, a stage for investment, and a talking point in global democracy debates. The moment India began asserting its own interests, the tone changed. That warm smile turned into a cold, condescending glare. Suddenly, the West started expressing concern about freedom of speech, about minority rights, about democratic backsliding, not because those issues didn't matter, but because they became tools. Selective morality disguised as principled outrage, an old colonial habit wearing new liberal clothes. Let's be honest, how many times has the West partnered with brutal regimes when it suited its interests? How many times has democracy been used as a smokescreen for regime change, proxy wars, or economic control? Yet when India, a functioning democracy of 1.4 billion people, chooses to pursue its own path, it's painted as problematic. Because real partnership in the Western worldview often means obedience. It means following the rules of a game you never agreed to play. It means taking cues from institutions headquartered in cities that once ruled the world with a flag and a whip. India, with its civilisational confidence slowly reawakening, has started to question the terms of this engagement. Why must it align with US positions on global conflicts that don't serve its interests? Why must it pick a side in a Cold War 2.0 it didn't start? Why must it be grateful for cooperation that often comes with strings disguised as handshakes? This illusion of partnership cracks when you realize how quickly friendship turns transactional. One moment, you're being praised as the world's next superpower. The next, you're being lectured about press freedom by countries whose own media are owned by billionaires and corporate lobbies. It's not just hypocrisy, it's structural. Western partnerships are often designed to maintain hierarchy, not to dismantle it. Aid comes with conditions, trade comes with tariffs, tech transfer comes with backdoors, and praise comes only when you parrot the narrative. The West, despite its liberal varnish, still holds the reins of global discourse. It decides who gets to be called a democracy and who's sliding. It decides which wars are justified and which aren't, which sanctions are righteous and which crimes are overlooked. Neocolonialism isn't about red coats or stolen jewels anymore. It's subtler now, silkier in tone, wrapped in the language of development, democracy, and digital inclusion. The chains aren't iron, they're policy frameworks. The empires don't arrive on ships, they arrive via apps, aid, and international consulting firms. And in this modern theatre of power, India finds itself in the uncomfortable position of being lectured to by those who once ruled it with guns and trade routes. The faces have changed, the words are prettier, but the gaze, that paternal, condescending gaze, remains intact. The West, especially the United States, continues to approach India not as an equal but as a project. A nation to be helped, guided, nudged toward the correct geopolitical behaviour. What is this if not colonialism with better branding? The kind where universities, think tanks, and NGOs take the place of viceroys, but the underlying mission remains the same: reshape the native mind to mirror the imperial ideal. It's no longer about converting temples into churches, now it's about converting civilizations into compliant subsidiaries of a globalist order. Look at how the narrative is crafted. When India resists Western pressure, say on buying Russian oil, developing indigenous tech, or enforcing its own data laws, it's painted as obstinate, illiberal, or alarmingly nationalistic. But when a Western nation does the same, it's strategic autonomy. The double standard is staggering, and the hypocrisy is so casual it doesn't even blush. A Western power can bomb a country into the Stone Age in the name of democracy, but India passing regulations on social media platforms becomes an existential threat to free speech. Aid, too, often comes wrapped in the fine print of control. Development loans, climate funds, and trade agreements are rarely just about upliftment. They're leveraged tools to make sure the developing world stays in orbit around the Western sun. When India says, "We'll build our own infrastructure, thank you very much," the reaction isn't applause, it's suspicion. Independence is applauded only when it's symbolic. The moment it threatens economic or ideological supremacy, it becomes a problem. These tensions spill into the cultural space as well. Western media outlets obsessively frame Indian politics, policies, and people through a lens of dysfunction. Every move is dissected not for understanding, but for judgment. Headlines scream about religious tensions, caste issues, or authoritarian drift. Real problems, yes, but presented with the glee of a preacher spotting sin in someone else's temple. Rarely do these same outlets acknowledge the complexity, the scale, or the ongoing transformation of a civilization trying to navigate post-colonial recovery while being surrounded by 21st century predators dressed as partners. Meanwhile, the machinery of soft power continues to churn. Hollywood pop culture, global philanthropy, tech monopolies, all projecting a vision of modernity that subtly erases anything that doesn't conform to a Western script. India, with its own ancient philosophies, languages, and governance models, is expected to fall in line. Modernization is fine, they say, as long as it's Western modernization. Speak your language, but make sure your software runs on our cloud. Celebrate your culture, but filter it through our platforms. Worship your gods, but buy your ads from us. For too long, the world stage has been rigged like a two-player video game. Washington versus Moscow, then Washington versus Beijing. The rest, spectators in the gallery, watching the titans clash, dodging the falling debris, grateful to be noticed at all. But the script is unraveling, the curtains are shaking, and the orchestra is playing a tune no one fully recognizes. We are entering the age of multipolarity, not as a slogan, not as a think tank fantasy, but as a lived, tectonic, irreversible shift. And India isn't waiting to be invited to the table anymore. It's building its own. In this emerging world, no single capital dictates terms. There are many centers of power, many philosophies of governance, many visions of what the future should look like. And India is stepping forward not as a junior partner, but as a sovereign civilization with its own compass. This isn't about choosing between America's fading empire or China's rising order. It's about refusing the premise entirely. Why should India pick sides in a game it didn't design between players it didn't vote for? Multipolarity doesn't mean chaos. It means complexity. It means a world where New Delhi speaks to Moscow, Washington, Tehran, and Tokyo in the same breath, where trade routes crisscross continents without needing Atlantic approval, where strategic decisions are based not on ideology or inherited alliances, but on national interest and pragmatic diplomacy. India is buying oil from Russia, arms from France, chips from Taiwan, while launching satellites and leading global digital inclusion. This isn't inconsistency, it's sovereignty at scale. But this new posture makes the old gatekeepers nervous, because the rise of multipolar power means the end of monopoly, not just in politics, but in morality, media, technology, the values. For decades, the Western world sold itself as the final form of civilization, liberal democracy, neoliberal markets, universal human rights, all packaged in English, exported in dollars, enforced with drones if necessary. Now, countries like India are asking a simple but dangerous question: what if that's not the only way? What if democracy can wear a dhoti? What if progress doesn't come through imitation but reinvention? What if a billion-strong nation can define its own modernity, rooted not in imported blueprints, but indigenous knowledge systems, hybrid governance, and culturally resonant ethics? This, more than anything, unsettles the old order, not because it's aggressive, but because it's alternative, because it proves that global leadership doesn't have to wear a Western face. Breakup, the Global South, regional forums, these are not just alliances of convenience. They are scaffolding for a new architecture, one that dilutes hegemonic control and allows for plural narratives. In this world, India is not just reacting to power, it is producing it. Strategically, culturally, digitally. A nation once boxed in by Cold War logic is now fluid, uncontained, refusing the false binaries of past decades. It can walk into Washington with confidence and leave for Tehran without apology. It can host Western CEOs in Bangalore while negotiating in yuan in the East. In the age of algorithms and artificial gods, power no longer flows just from oil fields or missile silos. It pulses through data centers, software protocols, and silicon chips. Whoever controls the code controls the command. For decades, technology has been wielded not just as a tool, but as a leash. Nations that embraced the digital revolution were often unknowingly shackled to it, locked into ecosystems built and owned elsewhere, governed by terms they didn't write, surveilled by eyes they couldn't see. For India, tech sovereignty isn't just a buzzword, it's a matter of survival. The myth was seductive: let Silicon Valley lead, let the private sector innovate, let the invisible hand code your future. And India, like many others, bought in, welcoming big tech with open arms, letting foreign giants harvest its data, dominate its digital markets, and dictate the pace of innovation. But the honeymoon wore off quickly. Beneath the glossy user interfaces lay monopolies disguised as platforms, backdoors, masters, features, and terms of service that read like colonial treaties in digital form. If oil was the resource that triggered 20th century wars, data is the 21st century's blood diamond, extracted from billions of users, mined by algorithms, sold to advertisers, governments, and whoever paid the highest price. India began to wake up. Slowly at first, digital taxation here, regulatory frameworks there. But then came the push for indigenous infrastructure, a digital public stack built not for profit, but for people. UPI, Aadhaar, ONDC, tools that weren't built in California but in Bengaluru, not for Wall Street returns but for national empowerment. India began asserting control over its data, its platforms, its online marketplaces, not just to compete, but to escape dependency, to ensure that 1 billion citizens don't become digital serfs in someone else's empire. This desire for tech sovereignty is mirrored by a broader economic awakening. For decades, economic policy was dictated by imported ideologies, trickle-down mantras, structural adjustment prescriptions, free market fantasies that benefited the few and indebted the many. The promise was clear: open your markets, privatize your industries, and the blessings of the global economy will rain down like confetti. What actually rained down was inequality, debt traps, and supply chains more fragile than paper temples in a monsoon. India is rewriting that script. Manufacturing is coming home. Defense production is going indigenous. Strategic sectors, semiconductors, telecom, renewable energy are no longer left to the mercy of global corporations or unpredictable allies. Trade partnerships are being recalibrated, not through ideology but through cold, sovereign logic. Who serves India's interest? Who respects its autonomy? Who doesn't flinch when New Delhi says no? Tech sovereignty and economic independence aren't about isolation, they're about insulation. About creating firewalls against coercion, tariffs, sanctions, and manipulation. About making sure the engine of Indian growth doesn't run on software licenses leased from abroad or components that vanish the moment a superpower gets offended. It's about rejecting the digital feudalism of platform capitalism and building an ecosystem where India is not just a user, but a creator, regulator, and rightful owner of its economic destiny. Culture isn't just art, language, or tradition. It's architecture for how a civilization thinks, feels, and imagines itself. For centuries, India's cultural compass has been pulled off course, first by colonizers with Bibles and bayonets, then by the soft seduction of post-colonial westernization wrapped in the comforting illusion of progress. What began as a political liberation in 1947 did not immediately translate into cultural decolonization. The chains left the wrists but clung tightly to the mind. This cultural dislocation has taken many forms. English became the language of aspiration, not just communication. Western universities became arbiters of truth, even on Indian history. Indian spiritual systems were demoted to alternative, wellness trends, while Western frameworks, be they academic, legal, or social, were treated as the default setting for modern life. Bollywood, once a bastion of uniquely Indian storytelling, began mimicking Western tropes, glamorizing hyper-capitalism, sanitizing civilisational memory, and selling synthetic versions of love, rebellion, and freedom that rarely had roots in the Indian soil. But the tide is shifting. A realignment is underway, not towards nostalgia, but towards rooted modernity. A growing chorus of Indians are asking, why must progress come at the cost of self-erasure? Why is a Harvard professor the final authority on India's past? Why is tradition always portrayed as regressive, while imported values are automatically progressive? Why do Indian aesthetics need global validation before being celebrated at home? This realignment isn't about rejecting the world, it's about rebalancing the self, it's about reclaiming the right to interpret, to narrate, to define. Across literature, cinema, fashion, education, and even architecture, there's a resurgence of pride in Indian thought. Unapologetically philosophical, spiritually plural, emotionally layered, and intellectually deep, Sanskrit phrases are no longer just mantras, they're being re-explored as systems of logic. Ayurveda isn't fringe, it's now backed by data and confidence. Festivals aren't just holidays, they're cultural assertions in a world increasingly homogenized by algorithm-fed minimalism. This awakening is threatening to those who've long positioned themselves as the cultural custodians of the global south. When India begins to define its own gender norms, its own approach to rights, governance, ethics, and aesthetics, not in defiance of modernity, but in dialogue with its own history, it breaks the monopoly. It dares to suggest that liberalism isn't universal, that rights can coexist with duties, and that spirituality and rationality aren't mutually exclusive. The global liberal order, which sells the illusion of universal culture, packaged in Netflix pop feminism and sanitized multiculturalism, starts to tremble when faced with a civilization that doesn't want to dissolve into it. India's refusal to be aesthetically, ethically, or spiritually colonized again is not just nationalistic noise, it's civilizational resistance. And that resistance doesn't come through war or aggression, but through confident creation. Through temple restorations, indigenous knowledge systems revived in schools, Sanskrit spoken on stage, regional languages reclaiming political space, classical music retaking cultural platforms that had been hijacked by trend cycles curated in the West. Every empire, every ideology, every era has its arc, its rise, its climax, its inevitable decline. And as one global order phrase at the seams, another chapter begins, not as a sequel to the last, but as a different story entirely. India, no longer waiting in the wings, is stepping into this unfolding narrative not as a follower, not as a rebel, but as a force writing its own script in a language rooted in millennia of memory. This new chapter is not just geopolitical, it's philosophical. It's not just a change in alliances, it's a change in posture. India is not leaning toward or away from the West or the East, it's standing upright, centered. For too long, its foreign policy was shaped by either colonial trauma or Cold War binaries. But those ghosts no longer govern the room. India is now asking what serves us, not just in security, but in spirit. What kind of nation do we want to be? Not in the eyes of Washington or Beijing, but in the mirror of our own civilization. In this chapter, India doesn't beg for validation. It offers partnership on equal terms. It doesn't align blindly. It evaluates strategically. It doesn't outsource its priorities. It defines them. Multilateralism is no longer a club to gain entry into. It's a table India helps build. Forums like BRICS-SCO, the International Solar Alliance, and the rise of the Global South aren't symbolic, they're structural shifts. India is no longer speaking to the world through someone else's megaphone. It's building its own communications tower, and the world is listening. This isn't isolationist bravado. It's not chest-thumping nationalism dressed in economic jargon. It's quiet confidence rooted in a civilizational ethos that understands long games. India doesn't need to sprint to prove its place. It moves with the patience of a country that's outlived empires, weathered invasions, absorbed contradictions, and still remained itself. It knows how to modernize without mutilating its soul. It knows that strength isn't found in mimicry, but in mastery. Economically, India is decoupling where it must and integrating where it chooses. It's no longer content with being a market. It wants to be a manufacturer, a designer, a standard setter. Politically, it refuses to be dragged into ideologically charged conflicts where it has no stake. Militarily, it is diversifying suppliers, indigenizing production, and defining deterrence on its own terms. Culturally, it's done apologizing. No more bowing to frameworks that treat ancient wisdom as superstition and post-colonial scars as permanent disabilities. The new chapter is complex, non-linear, full of contradictions, just like India itself. It doesn't look like anything the West has seen, which is exactly why they don't quite know how to handle it. It's a civilization state navigating the 21st century not as a digitized clone of liberal democracies, but as something original, something that doesn't fit neatly into policy white papers or headlines written in London or New York. This chapter doesn't begin with a declaration. It begins with a refusal, the refusal to be defined by others, spoken for by others, or used by others as a proxy in someone else's power game.